So good morning, everyone. I think we'll make a start to the session. So thank you for joining us to learn more about the recently launched draft version of Scotland's Equity Toolkit. My name is Karen Pride and I am an Education Scotland Attainment Advisor supporting delivery of the Scottish Attainment Challenge. I'm joined by my Attainment Advisor colleagues Helen Friel and Jackie Ballantyne, and by Craig Sim, a Deputy Head Teacher at Meldrum Academy in Aberdeenshire. This session will look at how the toolkit can support enhanced approaches for equity and improved educational outcomes with a focus on tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. We will also cover why this resource has been launched as a draft and the importance of your involvement with the national consultation to shape its design and content. Before getting into the session, I'd like to remind colleagues of some housekeeping items which are on screen, including all participants should have their mics switched off unless they are speaking to prevent any background interference. It's optional to keep your camera on or off, but please be reminded this session is being recorded and that no individual recordings or screenshots are permitted throughout the session. Please try to be as present as possible. We know that distractions can happen, but it will just help to ensure active participation. If you encounter any technical problems, please use the chat function to communicate them, or Speakeasy Live support tool in the portal in the main room. Also, please use the chat function throughout to ask questions or raise your virtual hand at the Q&A session later on. Our colleague Jackie Ballantyne will be monitoring the chat, and we've allocated, and she'll be responding as we go, and we've allocated time at the end of the session to respond to any questions that are posed. If preferred, you can also send emojis or reactions in the chat. And finally, if you'd like to tweet about your experience, then please use the hashtag SLF 2022. So I'll provide an outline of this morning's agenda, which includes an overview of the toolkit, which I'll move on to in a moment, before passing over to Helen Friel for a demonstration of how the toolkit may be used to address an aspect of readiness to learn. We'll then hand over to Craig Sim to provide information on how Meldrum Academy may use the resource to support enhanced approaches for equity with families and communities. And as already stated, we will return to any questions posed at the end. So the refreshed mission of the Scottish Attainment Challenge, and what is that? So in November 2021, the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills announced plans for the Scottish Attainment Challenge for this parliamentary term. Plans outlined aim to support recovery from the pandemic and accelerate progress in closing the poverty-related attainment gap. These plans were formally launched in March of this year, with a refreshed mission, which is to use education to improve outcomes for children and young people impacted by poverty, with a focus on tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. In summary, the plans are that with the support of £1 billion of investment over this parliamentary term, will include continued empowerment of head teachers through pupil equity funding, or PEF, whereby approximately £130 million is allocated annually to 97% of our schools. There'll be continued investment to support care experienced children and young people, contributing to keeping the promise. There is the introduction of the Strategic Equity Fund, which is over £43 million, which will be distributed annually to every local authority. There's investment in national programmes to enhance supports across the system, supporting a range of national initiatives such as youth work and mentoring. And there's a broader recognition of children and young people's achievement and attainment. The refresh mission also introduced the framework for recovery and accelerating progress, which includes reinforcing our collective commitment to equity in education to mitigate the impact of poverty on children's outcomes and tackle the poverty-related attainment gap. It's also to set high expectations, including annual, ambitious, locally identified stretch aims to help ensure significant progress is made in recovering from the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic and in achieving the mission of the Scottish Attainment Challenge. All of this is clearly articulated through the Scottish Attainment Challenge Logic Models Theory of Change, which you can see on screen and is readily located and accessed through the toolkit. To reflect the ambitions laid out in the refreshed mission, one of the top priorities from the Scottish Government is to accelerate both recovery and progress in tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. To support this, Scotland's Equity Toolkit has consistently and coherently woven these golden threads through its design and content. This has been underpinned by robust and high-quality data, evidence and research and practice about what has happened when particular approaches have been used in schools and other settings to increase awareness and understanding of approaches which support equity and support sustainability, increase access to high-quality information for practitioners to inform support for children, young people and families impacted by poverty through an equity lens, to increase the pace and consistency of progress by reducing variation in outcomes through guiding complex change and effective implementation of equitable approaches. And finally, to enhance continued support for recovery from COVID-19 on children and young people's health and well-being and their learning through equity-informed practice, providing opportunity for education professionals to deepen and extend their knowledge and understanding of the impact of poverty on learning and the effective approaches that support children and young people most impacted by it. This includes enhanced leadership, pedagogical approaches, and partnership working. So what is it? What is Scotland's Equity Toolkit? Well, quite simply, it is a one-stop resource for the refreshed mission of the Scottish Attainment Challenge. It uses universal terminology in the main to ensure practitioners involved in delivery of the Scottish Attainment Challenge can relate to it. We understand there's a vast array of information that's in our education system's melting pot of research, evidence, advice, and best practice. And when we add more information into the system, it's intended to be helpful. However, with the best of intentions, sometimes this can be counterproductive. And whilst understanding the range of high-quality information available, it can be overwhelming and at times confusing to navigate to the answers you're searching for to provide a coherent and streamlined answer. So whilst the COVID-19 pandemic offered reflections for different ways of working, good, bad, or indifferent, the importance of addressing the health and well-being of our children, young people, their families, and that of our workforce, our colleagues and partners is paramount. Therefore, Scotland's Equity Toolkit was shaped to avoid practitioners using their invaluable time searching that vastness by using the interactive dashboards and navigation buttons to reduce time spent locating content and instead signposting information that directly addresses equity and the refreshed mission of the Scottish Attainment Challenge within sections that communicate to all stakeholders involved in the delivery of improving outcomes for learners affected by poverty. There is no expectation to read through the 166 pages of the resource. You can if you want to, but the toolkit has been designed to be as interactive as possible, as close to the functionality of a website within a resource as possible. Drawn upon learning from Professor Muir's report, Putting Learners at the Centre towards a Future Vision for Scottish Education, we wanted to increase overall coordination and coherence of information and make the resource easier to navigate and more user-friendly. This also involved utilising feedback from Education Scotland's digital services and the transformation programme to adopt what's called a more utilitarian approach, which has been preferred by practitioners gathered through feedback to come into a resource, find what they need, and then leave, similar to that of a Wikipedia. So the draft toolkit contains 10 sections, as you can see on screen, and each section directs you to what can we do to support recovery and accelerate progress, conditions for success and sustainability, exemplars, reflective questions, useful resources, and research and articles. The toolkit has been designed as a learning resource which will be informed and updated as evidence, research, and effective practice emerges. The toolkit endorses key principles and features of the National Model of Professional Learning and may be used flexibly to support activities including professional reading and research, professional dialogue, professional inquiry, planning, and self-evaluation. So the other question, who is it for? So the resource is being developed for practitioners involved in improving outcomes for children and young people most impacted by poverty, including but not limited to school leaders and local authority staff, youth workers, and third sector partners. There are many examples for how the toolkit can be used to ensure equity within pedagogical approaches or when addressing attendance or developing and maintaining partnerships. This morning we will hear 2 examples to demonstrate how you may use the toolkit to navigate content to support equity and readiness to learn, and also Meldrum Academy's intended use for supporting families and communities. I'll pass you over to Helen, who will walk us through the Equity Toolkit and readiness to learn, followed by Craig from Aberdeenshire.
Thanks, Karen, and good morning, everyone. So as Karen has said, I'm going to demonstrate how the toolkit might be used for the purposes of the demonstration. I've thought about readiness to learn and specifically mental well-being. So if I were a practitioner thinking about my class or my learners, or perhaps a deputy head with responsibility for pupil support, I could open the toolkit and go to the contents page, which you can see on screen just now. If it were the first time that I'd visited the toolkit, I'd want to have a look at the foreword. I'd also want to have a look at the introduction section. But for today, let's assume that's already been done and I'm ready to start using the toolkit. So looking at the options, I can see that there's a section on mental health and wellbeing, and that's definitely relevant for what I'm looking for. But there are other sections there that I might want to have a look at as well if I don't find what I'm looking for in the mental health and wellbeing section, or actually if I'm just looking for a bit more information later on. So that might include the families and communities section. It might include teaching, curriculum and assessment. It might include the PEF, the pupil equity funding section. And I'll definitely want to have a look at the implementation section if implementation science isn't something that I've used before, because that would be really, really helpful to make sure that any change that I'm going to implement has the best chance of success. But in the time that's available today, I'm just going to focus on that main section, mental health and well-being. Because as a practitioner or a deputy head, I think that's going to have the answers that I'm looking for. Okay, so when I go to that section, I land in the contents page, which you can see on screen. And as Karen has already said, that's the same for every section in the toolkit. So I'm going to start with the section overview, just to make sure that I'm in the right place for what I'm looking for. So if we go to the overview, so as you can see, it provides some helpful context setting. And in this case, the overview also provides some sources that highlight the link between poverty and mental health and wellbeing. And these could be used with colleagues at a later point as well. But having read the overview, I can see this absolutely is a section that I want to be in. So I'm going to go back to the contents page now. And I can see the various subsections within this section. So I'm going to start with the reflective questions. And I'm going to look at these now rather than later in the process, because I'm hoping that looking at the reflective questions, engaging that bit of self-evaluation will start to steer me in the right direction by getting me thinking about what might be missing from the current approach and therefore what I might want to be focusing on. So it's light touch reflection at this stage, but these and possibly other questions from the SAC self-evaluation resource and also from How Good Is Our School, How Good Is Our Early Learning and Childcare could be used later on to undertake deeper reflection with colleagues, perhaps also with learners and parents that are involved in the improvement process. But for now, I'm just going to have a wee look at these questions. And as I do, I'm starting to think about the need for a strategic approach, whether that's at class level or at whole school or centre level. Reading the questions might lead me to reflect on how well I and others in my school or centre understand the behaviours that often accompany poor mental wellbeing and the support needs that sit beneath those. It might get me thinking about the consistency in the language and in the understanding being used by staff, and whether there is that shared commitment to collective responsibility for mental health and wellbeing. So reflective questions in this section are starting to help me form an idea of what might be involved in improving the approach. So if I go back to the contents page now, and I'm going to look at the what can we do section. Thanks, Karen. So here I can see an outline of a whole school approach, and there are two links on the page. There's a link to a framework that's been developed for the Scottish Government, developed by practitioners, local authority staff, and it's there to provide a support framework for schools looking to develop that whole school approach. But there's also an exemplar there for William Wood High School. So not only are you getting the theory, the here's what you can do in terms of the framework, but you're also getting an example of a school's journey, a school that's already been on this journey and what their story is. Karen, could you go back to the what can we do page just now? Thanks. So even if you're a practitioner thinking about your class or learners rather than a deputy head who's thinking about a whole school approach, the 8 principles there can be applied and adapted for class level. Leadership, ethos of environment, identifying need and measuring impact, the voice of learners, professional learning, etc. These are all relevant whether you are operating at class and learner level or whether you're thinking about whole school levels. So Karen, if we could go back to the framework again, if you don't mind clicking that link, thank you. So clicking the link takes you to the framework. I'm obviously not going to take you through the framework this morning because this is just really a demonstration about how to use the toolkit. But when you look at the resource, this framework, you would see that it's not a start from scratch resource, which is good because it's not what I would want to do as a practitioner, it's not what I would want to do as a deputy head, because I know there are aspects of current practice that are working well. So instead, this approach is about complementing what you're doing already and strengthening it. So you can see that in the toolkit, the resources and the support materials that we've selected, they've been selected carefully because they're going to be useful, because they're flexible and they're adaptable. So further engagement with the framework and its 8 principles would help you at whatever level you're operating at to begin to develop an effective approach in a planned way, either as part of the school's improvement cycle or as part of your professional learning plan. Okay, so if we go back to the toolkit, Karen, thanks. And as you can see, we'll not bother clicking on the William Wood link, but if you do, it takes you to the National Improvement Hub. And it gives you examples from William Wood's journey that you could use and you could learn from as well. Okay, so if we go back to the contents page, Karen, so I can see there's a subsection on conditions for success. So I want to go to that now and have a look at that. So we can see here, this page identifies some key considerations to ensure a successful approach. So I want to be thinking about these as I'm embarking on this improvement journey. So there's a focus on staff wellbeing, on professional learning, and you can see that there are particular references to trauma-informed approaches and sources of professional learning in relation to that. But there's also a focus there on ensuring the curriculum, learning and teaching approaches support good mental health and the need for tracking that well-being as well. So having engaged with the toolkit so far, I've undertaken some self-reflection, some self-evaluation, and that can be used with other members of either my class team or the wider school community, depending on the context. It's helped me to start to think about developing an improved approach. I've got the framework, so it's signposted a useful resource for me that will support the work. And the conditions for success, I've identified some key areas that I really need to be focusing on as I embark on the work that I'm going to undertake. And I'm starting to think about how colleagues and learners and families could be engaged in the development of the improved approach. Again, whether that's at class level or whether that's at whole school level. And because it's Scotland's Equity Toolkit, there's the underpinning rationale of the importance of understanding the link between poverty and poor mental health as well. We know that poor mental health is not exclusively poverty related, but research in this section highlights the extent to which poverty is a factor in poor mental health. So as I start to develop my ideas and I start to engage with the framework, I may want further information and examples depending on how that work's going. So Karen, if we could go back to the contents page. So there are other sections that I may want to make use of as I embark on the work. So for example, there's the exemplars section. So if we could go to that, Karen. So lots of different examples there that you may want to dip into. So for example, once we get started in my school, I might identify that our tracking and monitoring of wellbeing needs to be further developed. So there's an example there in the exemplars list from Gibbon Academy that I could go and have a look at, and it shares some of the templates they use and gives information about the approach. If we go back to the contents, Karen. So we've also got the useful resources section. So if we go and have a wee look at that. So again, some selected, this isn't everything that's available, but it's a selected set of resources from the National Health Service, from Education Scotland, from Scottish Government, that can be used to support professional learning, so that whoever is embarking on this improvement understands the what and the why and the how as well. So some useful resources there, and again, designed to be used according to what it is that your school or your setting or your class requirements are for the purposes of this improvement. And if we go back to the contents, Karen, and the last section is the research and articles section. And again, just some further reading there that you might want to look at, or you might want to signpost staff to, where it's relevant to the work that you're undertaking, just to underpin your improvement work. But these sections are very much about selecting what's relevant for what you're doing. There's no expectation that you would be looking and using all of these resources. So, as I indicated at the outset, I would also want to look at the implementation section, but I'm not going to do that today, obviously. I hope this very condensed demonstration of one way of using the toolkit has been helpful. I hope it's been reassuring also in that it's made clear that with this vast resource, as Karen pointed out at the start, with all its pages, it's not designed to be read through from start to finish. Where you go and how you use the toolkit will very much be determined by your needs, the needs of your class, the needs of your department or your school. I'm going to pass to Craig now, who's going to talk us through how his school is planning to engage with the toolkit, and I'll let Craig introduce himself and his school. So over to you, Craig.
Good morning. Thank you, Helen, and good morning, everyone. I am Craig Sim. I'm a Deputy Head Teacher at Meldrum Academy in Aberdeenshire. And as Karen has outlined, the draft version of Scotland's Equity Toolkit has only been in the public domain for a few weeks. But just to be clear, I've not been asked to speak to you today regarding this kit because we are some kind of trailblazer school of any kind. I'm not claiming that. Don't think that we picked this up on the day of the publication and done nothing since and just immersed ourselves in it. If only we had the time. I was fortunate to have had a sneak preview of the toolkit. I spent time with Education Scotland on secondment last session before I returned to school this summer. So we have managed as a senior leadership tool team in school to have a look at this toolkit a wee bit earlier in the session and to consider how it can be used to help us. Helen's mentioned context, and therefore I think, as we all know, context of our schools is important. So I'll briefly outline ours and how it affects our use. So Meldrum Academy's role, our role sits as of today at 1,004 pupils. We are, however, located in a very small town in Aberdeenshire with a population of 3,000 people. And as a result of that, around 75 to 80% of our young people are transported to school from outlying areas. We've got 12 feeder primary schools within our cluster that ranges from schools of 24 pupils to one large school of 350. Our SIMD profile for the school shows that 95% of our young people and population live in deciles 7, 8 and 9. So on the face of that, using that measure, it would suggest a relatively affluent profile for our community. However, we've found that using SIMD is a much less reliable indicator for poverty within our communities, with rural poverty definitely a factor for many of our families. So where to start with the toolkit? As both Karen and Helen have said, the toolkit is a significant document with many sections. So where to start? So in Meldrum, we've decided to look at a particular section in the first instance and use it to help with our self-evaluation of the work that we have done and attempted to do over time with our families and communities. So we've tried over a number of years to introduce family learning and enhance family engagement. And I'll be honest and we'll say we have had varying degrees of success. Part of that can be down to the geographical spread of our school community, which causes us a bit of challenges. We have a high proportion of our families live more than 5 miles from our school, and in areas where public transport is largely a non-event or practically non-existent. So this means often getting them physically into the building has proved difficult at times. And again, we know that for many schools with COVID hitting and lockdowns, that's created almost an artificial distancing between schools and their families. So it's a challenge. So using the toolkit, we wanted to consider how effective the support we've given to families and communities of Meldrum has been over the last 2.5 years, really, since COVID. As a school, the senior leaders felt confident that we provided good support. However, we needed to take a bit more systematic and reflective view of that support to allow us to consider how we can support our families more effectively going forward and improve what we do. So we decided to start almost near the end of the families and community section, using on page 88 the reflective questions in there. So similar to what Helen has done, didn't start necessarily at the beginning using the reflective questions, and Karen has kindly put them up on the screen for us. We didn't even start with question 1 as our reflective questions. We kind of started looking at 5, 6, 7, 8 and 9. And within the first couple of those in question 5, and they're not numbered but bullet point 5, how were the views of parents and families and wider community heard? So we think we've done okay, but actually have we engaged our parents and families in what we've provided? Did we provide them what we think they needed rather than what they said they wanted? So that was one of the questions we've put around the table and how we do that. And then the next one that kind of follows on from that, to what extent do they inform our planning and how it is fed back to them? So again, did we just make an offer rather than actually what they want? How well do we know and understand the wider community? And that's something we do think we've got really well at Meldrum. So as I say, in our own view, we think we've offered effective and useful support to families, including food parcels. We've got access to a basic bank in school for children and young people. We've assisted with making connections to partners such as social work, working with our local Rotary Club, community groups, and helping families to access things like food banks that they didn't know what to do. But I think we've got to use these reflective questions and family engagement to find out, did we actually do as well as we think? What did our families and communities think? We think we've done well because we've been able to do most of this because our pastoral care, as we call them in Meldrum, but our guidance staff and our pupil support workers know our families and communities really well. And as I say, on our initial reflection, we maybe believed what we offer would be useful rather than asking our families what is it they need. So that's kind of part of our next steps. We also need to ensure that we scratch the surface a little deeper, because although we think we know our families well, we are sure that there are probably some that we just haven't got to yet. So we need to be able to target more families, and those families who have particularly remained quiet and not reached out. So as a school, we feel we've, as I say, a good understanding of the community, but we want to build on this and we know we can do better. We feel that the links we've made in our community in support and health and well-being can be extended to perhaps improve engagement as we seek to then move back towards family learning, which is something we kind of have tried less of over the last 2.5 years, but maybe didn't try more of in previous times. Aspects of the toolkit within the families and community section, I think that will help us further. We'll be in identifying our partners from further afield, such as national organisations that are listed in here. We need to go and look at the cost of the school day and better use of that. Exemplars of more successful family learning. And I think sometimes when we've tried things in the past for family learning, again, we've maybe gone down that route of what do we want to offer rather than what are people looking for. So we need to look more at the exemplars and say, where has the success been evidenced elsewhere so that we can build on that rather than reinventing our own wheel. The other area of the toolkit that we're going to consider is implementation. And although there's a whole section on implementation, there's one particular link that I found useful within the families and community section, and that sits on page 71, and it links to something called by the EEF, which is Putting Evidence to Work, a School's Guide to Implementation. Karen is navigating to that link just now. There is a poster there that Karen's going to just scroll down, recommendations poster. And it's interesting when I looked at this, and it's a 6-stage model for successful implementation. It was I think it was in the context of a behavioural guidance that they looked at one point, but it's actually a useful, simple 1-page implementation model. And I thought about this, and we thought about this as a leadership team, and thought, how often do we jump in at 4 and 5? Rather than actually start at the beginning, because I think the trick to getting step 6 of sustainability is to properly follow a model of implementation. So as a very simple thumbnail 1-page model, my own view and our view as a team is that that's a very good one, but there is far more detail in the implementation section of the toolkit itself. So we are by no means very far on or experts in using this kit, as I said at the start. I'm sure there will be other aspects of this kit we'll consider in time. Our advice would be not to feel daunted by its size, as I think Karen mentioned, it was 171 or 161 pages. Pick a section and consider that first within your own context. And look at it this way, as a colleague used to say to me often, remember, Craig, how do you eat an elephant? You eat it one bite at a time. And that's my advice for using the Equity Toolkit. Just take one bite at a time. So I hope that has been a helpful introduction to how Meldrum Academy intends to use this toolkit and has started its journey on it. Thank you for your time. I'll hand back to Karen.
Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Helen. That's really useful to hear how you guys, excuse me, are going to consider using the toolkit. And I think that's really good advice around not being put off by its size and to see its functionality as a website ultimately, rather than reading from page 1 to page 166. And I think in terms of the design of the toolkit, it's important to mention that, Craig, as you've said already, how you as a stakeholder was involved in its development, but thinking about that longer term product, if you like, the toolkit, the Scotland's Equity Toolkit, has been launched as a draft, a prototype that we're calling it, to be launched to the system for feedback. So this very much relies on consultation and collaboration with the system around what is useful to you. Where are the holes in the cheese? How could this be more accessible? How can it be easier to use? Hopefully, in terms of the functionality, you've been able to see this morning that it appears quite easy to use, and in terms of taking you directly into documents and then being able to navigate straight back. We have been adopting service design principles for the toolkit, hence its prototype status, so that come early 2023, we'll take everyone's feedback from the current consultation, which launched on the 5th of September and is open until the 7th of November. There are ways to access to provide your feedback, which is through a Microsoft form or by downloading the document. We have it available in Gaelic as well. And if there are any difficulties, then please contact us if there's any barriers, and we'll be able to help you to access that consultation, because those questions are around getting the answers for what is most effective and meaningful for yourselves out there in the system around supporting young people to have positive outcomes. So I'm not sure, Jackie, if there's any questions in the chat. I'll stop sharing my screen for a moment just to check, seeing as I've not been able to see. And if not, then I'm going to pose a question to Craig. Are there any questions, Jackie?
No, at the moment, Karen, we don't have any questions. We've got a compliment from a couple of folks saying it looks really good, reflective questions are a good starting point, and that so far you've made some very practical, interesting points.
Super, good. Well, we want to be useful. But I'm really interested, Craig, because obviously you've described the demographic of your school, and I think that can be typical for a lot of schools where they're, I guess, the typical profile of SIMD doesn't fit with your school's population, so it can be quite difficult to target that hidden poverty, if you like. So just in terms of that families and communities picture, I was wondering to what extent you see the Equity Toolkit being used as a vehicle to support even a shared understanding with different sectors or partners within your communities that may have that knowledge that perhaps around that hidden poverty picture that perhaps the school or others are not aware of. Yeah,
I think our first support in our local community is our community learning development partners. Meldrum Academy, we were built 20 years ago as a brand new school and as a community school with CLD within the building with us, and that has allowed us over time to sort of foster relationships. There have been a number of structural changes and personnel changes within that in Aberdeenshire over time as well. But I think those are key partners to us in working. But we have a very active Rotary Club in Old Meldrum, and they have a great knowledge of the community and just links and networks. A lot of people tend there are generations of families within our community, so everyone seems to know a lot of people. I'll be honest, I think I've rarely worked with a head teacher who knows his community as well as my head teacher. He knows everybody, and he knows their dad and their granda, and he knows a lot about where the hidden poverty is. One of the examples is that Haddo Estate, Haddo House in Aberdeenshire, is a National Trust building, and it's within our community, and it sits in Decile 9. And Lord and Lady Haddo certainly wouldn't be only in Decile 9 in terms of financial wealth, but there are many houses within that are rented accommodation that come with fairly low wage economy jobs. But they all come within this rural poverty and postcode and SIMD. They all sit within Decile 9. But that's the kind of hidden poverty we have. So in terms of knowing it, it's that sort of local knowledge that can be important. But I do think we need to look at partners perhaps further afield from just the locality, and that's where I think some of the aspects of the toolkit will come in for us, and maybe looking outwards, if you like, to further afield in some of the exemplars of what people have done, whilst also not trying to to create almost a spider journey of you go in too many directions, trying to kind of keep things manageable for us.
Thanks, Craig.
Hi, Karen. We've actually got a question in the chat for you, round about how will you let senior management teams know about this toolkit? So I wonder if it's worth showing them the page on the hub, if that's possible.
Sure, no problem, Jackie. I can do that. Hopefully you can see that.
That's super, yeah, we can see that.
There's also work going on in terms of the attainment advisor team around how we implement the learning, or certainly the knowledge and awareness of the toolkit with sectors across education. So there's definitely, this is just the first step, I would say, in terms of its launch, and obviously it's a soft launch because it's a draft. Thereafter, as I was saying, after we've taken the feedback to pull it into shape and really take the learning, the further learning from more feedback through the national consultation, is to then have a formal, to have a forward and launch it again in a more formal sense in January 2023. But in the meantime, this will be getting into the hands of everyone that we can possibly think of in order to support our learners. But certainly by signposting people to the hub as a way to do that as well. We probably have time for one more question. I don't know, Helen, did you have a question? No. Is that? Yep, Craig, did you have any further questions?
I don't know that I've got anything to ask, have I?
No problem, that's fine. Thank you very much, everyone. So that leaves me to just thank everyone for joining us this morning. We hope you've learned more about how Scotland's Equity Toolkit can support enhanced approaches for equity and improved educational outcomes for learners, with a focus on tackling the poverty-related attainment gap. We'd be grateful if you would be able to share your feedback in our survey. I'll just pop it up on screen. If you'd be able to do that, whether it's on a smartphone or device using the QR code or via the link in the chat to the MS form. But thank you again, Helen, Craig, Jackie, for your participation, and equally to everyone who has responded in the chat and who's listened and engaged. That's very much appreciated. So take care and goodbye. Thank you.